It may be the only contact
We shall defend our
over which a
island,
blow-by-blow
whatever the
report
cost
flashes
may
from
be.
the local front
We shall
to the
fight on the
remote
beaches.
command
We
in Cairo,
shall
London.
fight on the landing ground. We shall fight in the field and in the sky. I do not for a moment believe this island, or a large part of it, was subjugated and starved. Beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British people. We shall never surrender.
This country is at war with Germany.
At 7:50 a.m. on the morning of August the 9th, 1945, air raid sirens began to ring out in the Japanese city of Nagasaki. However, a short while later, the sirens rang out again, indicating that there was no danger and people began to climb out of their shelters to carry on about their daily business. Japanese spotters had only sighted 2 US AAF B-29 bombers, not enough for an air raid on a major city, and presumed they were merely on a reconnaissance mission. At 1101 hours, a single bomb was dropped into the city's industrial area. The bomb detonated with the equivalent force of 22,000 sticks of TNT, which resulted in a blast so bright that it was seen by observers over 100 miles away. The fireball generated temperatures in excess of 3,900 degrees centigrade, and generated winds of up to 600 miles per hour that added to the destruction. Exact figures are unclear, but at least 129,000 people were either killed on the day, or would die in the weeks and even years that followed. 6 days after this attack, Japan surrendered to the Allies, bringing to a close the most destructive conflict ever recorded, that ended with the first 2, and so far only, nuclear attacks in history. It was the Second World War. It's impossible to dissect the causes of the Second World War without discussing the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and its leader, Adolf Hitler. Hitler was himself of Austrian birth, but he fought in the German army during the First World War. When the war ended with Germany's humiliation, Hitler felt especially bitter about it, and like many in Europe, he feared communism spreading beyond the borders of post-revolutionary Russia. In 1919, a year after the end of the war, he joined a new and little-known political group called the German Workers' Party, and used his great ability as a speaker to stir up crowds and gain support. A year later, the party was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, more commonly known by its English abbreviation, Nazi. In 1921, Hitler rose to become leader of the party, and again using his magnetic personality, he continued to garner more and more support, until 1923, the Nazis were confident enough to attempt a coup in Munich and seize power. Known as the Beer Hall Putsch, the effort failed and Hitler was arrested before being put on trial, but this only furthered the Nazi cause. Hitler used the trial to gain even more supporters, and despite him spending a year in prison, in which he wrote his autobiography Mein Kampf, the Nazis continued to establish themselves in German politics. Mein Kampf not only outlined his own story, but it also set about establishing his vision for the future of the German people, and how he believed subversive groups were holding them back from achieving their destiny through measures such as the Treaty of Versailles, which outlined Germany's surrender terms. He specifically identified Jews and communists as being the leaders of this great international conspiracy to keep the German people down after the war, highlighting the harsh conditions imposed on the country by the victorious Allies, such as the dissolution of Germany's empire and armed forces, the loss of territory to newly created countries in the east and France in the west, and having to pay crippling war reparations. The book effectively became the Nazi Bible. By 1933, the Nazi Party had secured enough political support that Hitler legally became Chancellor of Germany. He quickly began passing legislation that would transform Germany into Nazi Germany, and the swastika would symbolise this reinvigorated country. The prosecution of Jews, gypsies, and political opponents soon became government policy, as Hitler began preparing Nazi Germany to attain what he saw as its destiny, cantered around the concept of the Aryan race, with himself as the undisputed leader, the Führer. History records that the Second World War began in 1939. However, some historians now argue that it began in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in China. The Japanese deliberately detonated a bomb on a Chinese railway line used by Japanese citizens in order to blame it on Chinese dissidents. This was then used as a pretext to invade the country, and Japan would occupy the land there until liberated by the Allies in 1945. Japanese occupation of Chinese territory was extraordinarily harsh. Rape and murder were widespread and often encouraged by the Japanese leadership. While at Pingfang in northeast China, a military research unit was set up with a special mission. Designated Unit 731, thousands of Chinese civilians were used in nightmarish medical experiments to develop biological and chemical weapons, as well as carry out experimental surgeries, often without anesthesia, for fear of corrupting the data. In 1922, Benito Mussolini and his National Fascist Party rose to power in Italy. Very soon, he began reshaping the democratic political landscape of the country into a dictatorship cantered around himself. Mussolini, like Hitler in Germany, believed his country had a destiny and wanted to build a new Roman Empire, beginning with a massive build-up of his armed forces. He was not afraid to use them, and proved this when he sent his forces into Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, in 1935 to start the construction of his new empire in Africa. If Manchuria can be considered the first battlefront of World War II, then Abyssinia was the second. As the 1930s grew on, Hitler's Nazi Party became firmly embedded not just in German politics, but into German society on a whole. The German people had much to thank the Nazi Party for, since they had pulled the country out of the despair of defeat and reinvigorated it, promising that Germany would soon be attaining its destiny of becoming a great power again. Hitler's appeal and influence was not lost on foreign observers, many of whom admired him and even began to sympathise with the Treaty of Germany after the war. Proof of this was given when Hitler became Time magazine's Man of the Year. This played perfectly into Hitler's hands as he began making notions of regaining lost territory in the east and west of the country. The first test of how the Allied powers of Britain and France would respond to his new Germany came in 1935, when Hitler introduced military conscription, which saw the German armed forces swell many times beyond the number permitted by the Treaty of Versailles. But the Allies did nothing. Encouraged by this, he then ordered his troops into the Rhineland in 1936. The Rhineland had been demilitarized in 1925 in order to create a safety zone for France, who, along with Belgium, had occupied it for a time due to Germany's inability to pay war reparations. Hitler had given secret orders to his men that should they encounter French military resistance, they were to retreat because Germany was still in no condition to fight a war. Despite protests by France at the Legion of Nations, the precursor to modern-day UN, again they did nothing. In 1937, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin stood down, and was succeeded by Neville Chamberlain. Meanwhile, Germany continued to rearm, and now set their sights on reclaiming the German Sudetenland, which had been absorbed into Czechoslovakia after the war. At the same time, Hitler looked to his own birth country of Austria to become a part of his new Germany, although this was again forbidden by the Versailles Treaty. Austria and Germany had long had an almost symbiotic relationship, and both countries' people viewed the other as cousins. Austria even had its own Nazi party, and in January 1938, they attempted their own putsch, much like Hitler had tried in 1923. The putsch failed, and many leading Austrian Nazis were imprisoned. Hitler's propaganda machine went to work creating a false impression that Austrians were rising up in support of their imprisoned Nazis. And so, on March 12, 1938, German troops entered Austrian territory on the pretense of restoring order. Within weeks, the Austrian government was gone, and the country was absorbed into Germany as the province of Ostmark. A vote on joining Germany claims that 99% of the population supported the move, which was known as Anschluss. Having secured his home nation under a Greater Germany, Hitler declared himself as the advocate of all ethnic Germans in Europe, and primarily of those in Sudetenland, making clear his intention to absorb the region into Germany. A diplomatic crisis was sparked when, just like in Austria, a Sudetenland Nazi party rose up and began demanding autonomy from Czechoslovakia. The Czech government tried to negotiate with the Sudeten Germans, while a series of meetings were held between Germany, Britain and France to reach an agreement on the crisis, culminating in the Munich Agreement, which effectively gave a free hand to Germany's ambitions. No Czech representative was present. First, Hitler took the Sudetenland, and then in January 1939, he invaded and captured the rest of Czechoslovakia, in his first act of truly open aggression towards a neighbour. The conquest of Czechoslovakia raised concerns with the mighty Soviet Union, which was in the grip of the paranoid Joseph Stalin. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf that having to fight a war on two fronts was one of the reasons the Kaiser's Germany was defeated, and so, having already antagonised London and Paris, he was far more careful with Moscow and began a diplomatic effort with the Soviet Union to keep them out of events in the West. In August 1939, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop met with his German counterpart, Vyacheslav Molotov, in Moscow, where the two of them effectively divided up Eastern Europe into two, on the promise that neither would interfere with the other in those areas. The Soviet Union had its own interests in Poland and Finland, and so was happy to abide by this agreement, even though Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were ideological enemies. Despite this period of cooperation, many felt that it wouldn't last, but with Russia at bay, Hitler ordered his troops into Poland on September 1st, 1939.